Okay, we're ready to get started? Yeah, okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you for joining Poetry Daily and the Cheuse Center for our second of 4 co-sponsored Wet Translation Sparks virtual events. Before I begin, I'll just ask that unless you're speaking, please keep your microphones muted. And so just now I'll introduce myself, then I'll say a few words about this Wet Translation Sparks series at Poetry Daily. And then I'll introduce the poet translators who will then each read their translation, offer a bit of context, and then we'll get into the conversation and finally reserve a little time for the Q&A at the end. If you have a question, please send it through the chat and we'll address some questions at the end. So I'm Heather Green. I'm a writer and translator. I teach in the School of Art at George Mason, and I also serve on the editorial board for Poetry Daily, which is now housed within George Mason's MFA program. Poetry Daily is run largely by a team of graduate assistants and volunteers and is committed to publishing 1 new poem per day. For the past few years, the poem published each Monday is connected to our essay series called What Sparks Poetry, in which writers share something about their inspiration in writing a poem or reading a poem, or in the case of our current iteration of this series, on translating a poem. In this current series, which was developed by our editorial director, Sally Keith, and it's called What Translation Sparks, a stellar group of poet translators have been asked to share one of their seminal experiences in translation. And we've asked each of these writers to talk a little about how the work of translating poetry is essential to their practice of writing original poetry, if indeed they could be separated at all. Speaking for Poetry Daily, I want to thank our co-host, the Alan Cheuse International Writers Center, which is run by Matt Davis, who's here with us tonight. The Cheuse Center celebrates creative writing, including, of course, the art of translation, as a means of international dialogue, education, and understanding. At its core, the Cheuse Center facilitates the exchange of international creative writers and writing in order to help foster the tolerance and empathy a more connected world requires. I'll just mention that this What Translation Sparks series has already been going on for 8 weeks. So Martin just put a link to that, to the What Sparks Poetry list in the chat if you're interested in seeing some of the essays that have already been published, and it will keep going for the next few months. So each Monday, a new one will go up. Finally, I'm delighted to introduce with brief bios our wonderful panel here tonight of writer translators, each of whom have contributed so much to the US literary landscape through the books they've translated, written, and published through their presses and published themselves. Martin will also be adding a few links in the chat in case you'd like to read more extended bios or be able to look visually at the poems that they're going to read and read their essays in full. So I'll be going through the introductions alphabetically. Born in Lund, Sweden, Johannes Göransson now lives in South Bend, Indiana, where he teaches at University of Notre Dame. He's the author of 8 books, including Poetry Against All, The Sugar Book, and Transgressive Circulation, Essays on Translation, and the translator of several poets, including Asa Berg, Ann Jaderlund, Helena Boberg, and Kim Udium. Taije Silverman is a poet and translator. Her first book of poems is Houses Are Fields, and her selected poems of Giovanni Pascoli with Marina Della Puta Johnston was shortlisted for the 2020 John Florio Prize. Her poems and translations have appeared in journals including Poetry, The Nation, Plowshares, and the Best American Poetry Anthologies. She teaches at University of Pennsylvania. Jonathan Stalling is an American poet, scholar, editor, translator, professor, and inventor who works at the intersection of English and Chinese. He's the Harold J. and Ruth Newman Chair for U.S. China Issues, co-director of the Institute for U.S.-China Issues, professor of international and area studies, and affiliate English professor at the University of Oklahoma, where he's also the founding curator of Chinese Literature Translation Archive and a founding editor of Chinese Literature Today, as well as an editor of the Chinese Literature Today book series. Matvei Yankelevich edited and translated Today I Wrote Nothing, the selected writings of Daniel Karms, and is the co-translator with Eugene Ostashevsky of Alexander Vidensky's An Invitation for Me to Think, which received a National Translation Award. He's a founding member of Ugly Duckling Press Editorial Collective and has curated their Eastern European Poet series since 2002. He teaches translation and book arts at Columbia University School of the Arts, and his most recent book of poetry is Some Worlds for Dr. Vogt. So welcome panelists, and we'll now proceed alphabetically, beginning with Johannes, to hear a few poems and a few words about the translation of those poems.
Hi. Nice to see everyone. Thanks for inviting me. So yeah, the piece that I translated for the series was an excerpt from Eva-Kristina Olsson's, Swedish poet Eva-Kristina Olsson's long poem, The Angel Green Sacrament. This is the original book. It's got like, I don't know if you can see it. It begins with its cover. It's got kind of a flimsy blue-green kind of thing. And that is kind of what it's about, the flimsy blue-greenness, especially as it pertains to the angels that she has met or encountered. This was a book that came out in 2018. She was born in 1958, and she's been publishing books for quite a while. She's often associated with Ann Jäderlund, who's like the most prominent Swedish poet of the past 40 years, but she's been kind of like the underground Jäderlund, who's done things a little bit weirder. Yeah, so I thought I'd read a little bit from the beginning of the book. What I had on the website is a little bit further in, but I thought I would just read the very beginning, which I published on a journal called The Folder. All right. The illuminated cranium, which glows green and without light, would never melt into my wing, lies on the first step of the stairs, your sacrament, the midsummer solstice pistachio green angel, pistachio green body, born wings of no one more than no one are so light, disappear in light, never die, are never born, are light, nothing other than light, are so light, disappear in light, die always, are born always, are light, live on nothing, are born from nothing, live on nothing, die of nothing, angel green wings, carry the body, the cranium, don't be afraid, don't be afraid, you are afraid, the cranium, I have taken off the cranium, have you taken off the wings, have you taken off the wings and given them to me, have you taken me off, have I taken off your wings? But we are only your wings. There are no garments, only the garment, the stair step, how it submerges itself in the wings, step down into the reflection, stepping down, raised chasm, steps, wing steps, the times the angel green drapes, the stone steps over my shoulders. You open the stone and lay me open, angel mounted in stone, angel mounted in cranium. The pistachio green body and the wings brighter screams is your fear visibility's living nothing. This green light, the living and the dead, births a rising light. It shows nothing, this nothing which you love, this which shows it's nothing. I am coming to you. Don't be afraid. You're afraid. Now I'm taking the first step. Thanks.
Thank you for that. Okay, next up, I think we have Taije. I think you might still be muted.
Yeah. Unmute myself. How about this? Can you hear me? Okay. So this is going to be quite different. Like fully craniumed now. We're just going to be fully craniumed and unwinged. I am going to read a poem by, and is it Johann or Johannes or Johann? Johannes.
Yeah.
I didn't hear actually. Will you tell me again?
Johannes.
Johannes. So Johannes, I also just want to tell you that that was beautiful, and I'm a little bit in love with, I'm also going to say her name wrong, Eva Christina Olsen now. I'm actually going to turn my computer. Can you see what's on my mirror? Do you see that that the poem that you translated is, I stare at it. I've been, since you put it up. Yeah, she's really cool. She's really cool. So I am going to read a poem by Giovanni Pascoli, who is a turn of the century Italian poet. And he wrote about farms, and he wrote about his family. And yet he is hailed by Italians as the founder of modern verse. And I'll read a poem that he wrote in 1903. It is a slightly longer poem. It's a page and a half. It's called The Meteor, and it is originally in terza rima. Pascoli was also a Dante scholar. And I guess I'll just tell you that he starts by addressing, he's addressing the poem to a river who he considers a very dear friend of his. And then the direct address switches halfway through, and he's talking to someone else, and I have no idea who he's talking to. It's not his mother, it's not a lover. I don't know who he's talking to, but he's talking to someone who is dead. And the last thing I will say before I start reading is I'm hoping that you all will listen for a very weird switch in tenses. The poem starts out in the past tense, and then it moves to the present tense, and then it moves to the conditional tense, and then it moves to the future, all in recounting this memory, and then it goes back to the past tense. So maybe just listen for that that game of Twister. The Meteor. And it's in this book. I published this book last year of selected poems of Giovanni Pascoli with Marina Della Puta Johnston. Yeah, so that's that. The Meteor. Blackout. Above me, the sky shone a pale, clear blue. No one was there, no one near, except you, far away, Rio Salto, who flowed past my home. I didn't hear you. All I heard was your road crew of frogs out announcing the water, and always more water to pulp mills and farms. I thought of the past. I recalled how at 20, still fearful of life, I felt I'd die too in some blood-spattered way. And alone, late at night, I would come to this path where my enemy might lie in wait in the dark. I walked slowly, so slowly, my heart in my throat, while I feigned perfect calm, so he'd see I was brave, though I'd startle at wind or a firefly's spark. Slowly I crept, and my heart leapt ahead. And what then? A crash. Laid out flat on the path. I'd be gasping, alone, but not alone. The graveyard is near. Memorial lamps dimly kindling stones. My mother would come, a hand brushing my skin, and I'd feel her tears on my wound like cool dew in the dark. The others too will draw nearer and gather me up from the path, and with faint cries carry me off to their land, and they'll care for me there where you smile unending above your sloped pallet, now padded with mosses and grass like a nest. And musing, I heard beyond grapevines and next to the edge of a ditch by an elm, a rough hiss and a flash, a blast, blasting, open and glowing and falling, fallen from the infinite flicker of stars, a globe of gold that dove mutely toward fields, as if diving toward layers of mist, itself empty as mist. And inside its instant, it lit all the hedges and trenches and huts and clusters of forest and night drifting rivers and the white towered towns in the distance. Enraptured, I asked, "Did you see?" But there was only the sky, high and serene, not the sound of a step or silhouette. The sky, nothing more. Dark sky, surging with huge stars, a sky in which it seemed the world had been submerged. And I felt the earth inside the universe. Shaking, I felt earth as part of the sky, and I saw myself down here, bewildered and small, wandering on a star among stars.
Wow, thank you. That was a beautiful reading of an amazing poem. Okay, so Jonathan, I think you're next up, and then we can just go straight on into Matvei's after that.
All right, thanks so much. Well, it really is a pleasure to be here among all of you, and to share this Friday with you is really quite lovely. I have a very short poem, and so I'm going to actually read a couple of short poems. What I'm interested in talking about perhaps later, and the series of poems is about moving away from the image as the framework through which we think about classical Chinese poetry. This work is shifting instead to create the constraint, not of reproducing the images, but reproducing the prosody and the acoustic structure, as well as the poetics that undergirds that acoustic structure of classical Chinese poetry. So I'm just going to read a few, including the first one, the one that was on Poetry Daily. It's by the Tang poet Han Yu, better known as a prose writer, but I chose this poem because he follows all of the strictures of what's called Jinti Shi, or new style poetry. This poetry balances words and in a way that's similar to the yin and yang on both the horizontal and vertical axes. And so every word is counterpoised against the other, whether it has a long or short vowel sound, for instance. And so this poem is relatively perfect in following the rules. The poem is entitled Spring Snow. I prefer for this poem to chant the poem instead of recite it in the modern style. So this is a recreation of a Tang style chant. The melody chosen is based on the tonal prosody itself of Chinese, but this one was a guqin player in Yunnan named Miao Yichen, who arranged this to the guqin, which is a zither. So here it is, Chun Xue. 昔年都未有芳华，2月初惊见草芽，白雪却现春色晚，孤船听书作飞花。New Year's comes but blooms don't grow. March near, surprise, grass sprouts grow. Yet white snow thinks spring's come late, and falls through trees like blooms blow. The next poem I'll read in the modern style, although it is actually lyric, originally sung in the Song Dynasty. This is the poet is Li Yu, who's the last emperor of the Southern Tang Dynasty before the fall of the Tang to the Song. It was written in prison, and there are just a few of these poems written before he died, probably from poisoning. They have a beautiful kind of courtesan style, with a deep undergirding melancholy, which you'll pick up in the sonorous, I think, quality of the poem when read or when sung. I will read this one though, so you can hear the tonal bend a little more clearly. It's called 乌野体，林花续了春红，太匆匆。无奈朝来寒雨晚来风，雁之泪流人醉，几时重？自是人生长恨，水长东。Bring chill night wind blast. Love brings flow past. We're moving ahead now another 100 years. Actually, this would be 400 years or so to the Yuan dynasty. This is a different genre again. We started with a Tang quatrain called Jueju. Then we were doing a ci form, a lyric form from the Song, and now we're in the aria form. It's modeled after opera aria, and it's quite sonorous, but it became a written genre afterwards. This one I really like when chanted because of the vowels have an extremely plaintive tonality in them. You'll hear the poem is about starving people, which we get in the starving horse as one of the central images. The poem became the most famous example of imagism. Oh,
could we?
Is there?
I know we shouldn't interrupt you, but it's so beautiful. And actually, I think you froze for some of us. You froze when you were reading the translation of the last poem, and we wanted to hear it. Would you mind reading it again? Sorry to interrupt you. We wanted to hear it.
Not at all. Okay, here we go. So I can switch to iPhone for Q&A too, if that's better, because my connection's a little wobbly. Spring's red grove bloom ebb past, too fast, fast. Dawn will bring chill rain down, night wind blast. Rouge face cry, men's gay sigh, time pile fast. From our birth, lifelong dearth, springs flow past. And so as you can, I hope, hear the basic constraints on English, which maybe in the Q&A I can talk more about as an inspiration for writing original verse in these forms, has to be monosyllabic. And in these works, I'm tonalizing the English vowels exactly the same as the Chinese vowels, because English, you can stretch it and bend it, it doesn't matter, it still makes sense. Though I have another technique of encoding the English vowels in the same patterns as the classical Chinese. But here's the last one by Ma Zhiyuan. And again, it is almost purely images, and it's always been seen as the imagistic poem of China. But the beauty, really, so much of it lies in its sonorous, plaintive tone. Hu tang lao shu hu wen ya xiao qiao liu shui日人家古道西方收马夕阳西下断肠人在天涯 Dry vines, old trees, night crows, small bridge, men's home, stream flows. West wind, lean horse, old roads, slow sun sets west, near sky's edge, man's grief grows. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. And amazing. Johannes and Taije, it's great to be here with you, and thank you for inviting me to participate in this program and also in with the essay and translation on the Poetry Daily site. It's been it was a nice opportunity to get to talk about a poem I've been with for a long time. I guess I'm just going to say it's by Alexander Vidensky, little known Russian poet of the 20s and 30s. This poem is from 1934. Vidensky is less well known than his good friend Daniel Harms, with whom they together founded with a few other friends, founded the Oberyu group, which was a late avant-garde, Soviet avant-garde group that sort of fell apart in the early 30s for reasons of politics and aesthetics, shifts in those paradigms in the Soviet period. So I'm just going to read the poem. It's a bit long, so I don't want to take up too much time with description, but the poem has come to be called Rug Hydrangea, and you'll see why. I regret that I'm not a beast running along a blue path, telling myself to believe and my other self to wait a little. I'll go out with myself to the forest to examine the insignificant leaves. I regret that I'm not a star running along the vault of the sky in search of the perfect nest it finds itself and Earth's empty water. No one has ever heard of a star giving out a squeak. Its purpose is to encourage the fish with its silence. And then there's this grudge that I bear, that I'm not a rug nor a hydrangea. I regret I'm not a roof, falling apart little by little, which the rain soaks and softens, whose death is not sudden. I don't like the fact that I'm mortal. I regret that I am not perfect. Much, much better, believe me, is a particle of day, a unit of night. I regret that I'm not an eagle, flying over peak after peak, to whom comes to mind a man observing the acres. I regret I am not an eagle, flying over lengthy peaks, to whom comes to mind a man observing the acres. You and I, wind, will sit down together on this pebble of death. It's a pity I'm not a chalice. I don't like that I am not pity. I regret not being a grove, which arms itself with leaves. I find it hard to be with minutes. They have completely confused me. It really upsets me terribly that I can be seen in reality. And then there's this grudge that I bear, that I'm not a rug nor a hydrangea. What scares me is that I move not the way that do bugs that are beetles or butterflies and baby strollers, and not the way that do bugs that are spiders. What scares me is that I move very unlike a worm. A worm burrows holes in the earth, making small talk with her. Earth, where are things with you? Says the cold worm to the earth, and the earth, governing those that have passed, perhaps keeps silent in reply. It knows that it's all wrong. I find it hard to be with minutes. They have completely confused me. I'm frightened that I'm not the grass that is grass. I'm frightened that I'm not a candle. I'm frightened that I'm not the candle that is grass. To this I have answered, and the trees sway back and forth in an instant. I'm frightened by the fact that when my glance falls upon two of the same thing, I don't notice that they are different, that each lives only once. I'm frightened by the fact that when my glance falls upon two of the same thing, I don't see how hard they are trying to resemble each other. I see the world askew and hear the whispers of muffled liars, and having by their tips the letters grasped, I lift up the word wardrobe, and now I put it in its place. It is the thick dough of substance. I don't like the fact that I'm mortal. I regret that I am not perfect. Much, much better, believe me, is a particle of day, a unit of night. And then there's this grudge that I bear, that I'm not a rug nor a hydrangea. I'll go out with myself to the woods for the examination of insignificant leaves. I regret that upon these leaves, I will not see the imperceptible words, which are called accident, which are called immortality, which are called a kind of roots. I regret that I'm not an eagle flying over peak after peak, to whom came to mind a man observing the acres. I'm frightened by the fact that everything becomes dilapidated, and in comparison, I'm not a rarity. You and I, wind, will sit down together on this pebble of death. Like a candle, the grass grows up all around, and the trees sway back and forth in an instant. I regret that I am not a seed. I am frightened I'm not fertility. The worm crawls along behind us all. He carries monotony with him. I'm scared to be an uncertainty. I regret that I am not fire. That's Vidensky.
Thank you so much. That ending of that poem is incredible. Yeah, thank you all for sharing those works. I really encourage you all to go out and read the essays about these that each of these panelists have published in full. I've spent a lot of time with those essays over the past few days, and it's been extremely stimulating and inspiring. So I wanted to open up with a question that's kind of inspired by the title of Johannes' essay. Is titled The Art of Rift. And something I was thinking about after rereading these poems and reading your essays was that each one of these poems that you all just read, for me, seemed to have these like rifts opening through them in all of these different ways. And I'll just read here a little bit from Johannes' essay saying, using J.F. Martel from the Weird Studies podcast definition of a rift in relation to art. So I'm quoting, this definition would be imperfections, surreal excesses, strange turns of phrase, inconsistencies, end quote, that kind of open up the work of art to be experienced by, in this case, the reader. In the essay, Johannes, you talk about the translation as an art of exposing rifts in texts. And so, as I said, I thought all of these 4 poems had these different kinds of disruptions that created entry points for the reader, like that opening word blackout, or that you've translated as blackout in the Pascoli poem, prefiguring the meteor. And in Spring Snow, the spaces between the phrases or groupings of words sort of presented a kind of visual rift, but also that final image, and it's like almost double exposure between the snow and the blossoms that are sort of feel that they're happening at once. And in the Vidensky, I noticed the, first of all, as Matvei, you mentioned in your essay, that struggle between like the lyric I and then the I that is the EYE I, looking at each different thing, and that kind of opening between those two. So I just wonder if, Johannes, you might want to elaborate a bit on this notion of rift, and if any of you might want to respond of whether that connects with your translation practice, that concept of like exploiting or leaning into the rift, or whether it's really doesn't resonate for you and you would have a different kind of spatial way of thinking about this process. So feel free to jump in.
Was somebody supposed to speak first?
Oh, well, I think originally I was wondering if Johannes might want to
Maybe
elaborate a bit on the
lost the
concept of
connection for a
rift, and then
second.
anyone who wants to jump in and respond to that.
I lost the connection for a second, so if somebody else wants to begin, that would be great.
I guess maybe a real short comment. I think this idea of Johannes's, which is consistent in many ways with what Johannes has written in Transgressive Circulation, which is such a great book. I taught it this semester with in a kind of experiments in translation course, but it is like, it was extremely engaging, and the students were really like in tumult about it. So thank you, Johannes. And I think it's just interesting to note that is, I mean, I wonder if we can kind of cast that notion back toward 1903 or cast it back to the Tang Dynasty, which I think you could, but I wonder how modernist that idea is. And certainly it's something shared by Harms and Vidensky, and Harms writes a lot about slight error and the importance of the slight error in any great work. He's thinking also about music and about Bach even, and so he does cast it backwards into the past, but it does feel also like a rather modernist notion, or maybe postmodernist notion. But I'm sure that Vidensky shared this feeling with Harms. I have a feeling they may have spoken about it in the 30s, but the slight error, sort of theorizing on the slight error, is there in a very like actual way as a part of the poetics in the at least by the 30s in this group of Soviet writers coming out of the historical avant-garde, which I find interesting. Very similar notion to what you're saying.
I think if you go to Jonathan's translations, for me, the rift, maybe the rift is not exactly the right word, but it has to do with the way the formal qualities of the Chinese don't just get translated, but deform the English so that it feels like Jonathan is almost doing some kind of homophonic. No, that's not even right. It's just like, it's like a strange attractor twisting the way that he pronounces the English. So to me, that's what I was thinking about right now with, if there's a rift in Jonathan's, maybe it's not so much a rift as some kind of strange pull that makes visible the or not makes visible, but makes audible the translation or something like that. I find this when I'm reading when I give readings of translations, and I give if I read the Swedish one first, and then I start reading the English, and then I start realizing that I'm kind of using the Swedish part of my mouth to say the English, and people are like, "Are you trying to speak backwards? What are you doing?" And my mouth gets confused. I feel like Jonathan's project is maybe like a sort of formalized version of that, a more controlled version of my confused mouth.
I like that, Johannes. Yeah, I mean, that is the goal of this project, is to try to make the space between the two languages not only more audible, but something that we can experience and shape and explore, both in terms of the beauty and the expressivity of interlanguage. You know, interlanguages are essentially unstudied. They don't have graphemes that represent interlanguages. There's one very, very niche form of linguistics that studies learner languages as a space that people pass through when learning a second language. But in fact, most all of us who work in or across languages live in interlanguage until we die. But there's really no way to manifest this or to detect its prosody formally on the page. And so, you know, while I'm working, and, you know, in this case in the Chinese, I hope that I like this idea of you speaking with the Swedish side of your mouth, because that is, in essence, the purpose of much of this work, is to try to explore what I'm calling the phonotaxis of the space between languages.
Jonathan, am I muted? No, I think I'm okay. That makes me think of you know, the essay by Benjamin, The Task of the Translator, and his idea that all languages or translation speaks toward intention, the intention of meaning, and that in order to have a kind of a pure language, we need to look at those translations together and the intentions speaking together toward something singular that can't ever be articulated in words because it exists in the riffs, essentially. And I like too this sense of having a part of your mouth that speaks one language and a part of your mouth that speaks another language. And I might even extend it to other parts of the body. Certainly my face is very different when I speak Italian, and my hands do very different things when I speak Italian. And there is something about those riffs, or the way that there's also that essay by Anne Carson about Joan of Arc and Francis Bacon. I think we all know it. And she's describing that one word in the Odyssey, moly, that, remember that Odysseus shouldn't eat. It's that root in the ground, and he's not allowed to eat it because we don't know what it is. It's not translatable. It's just moly. What is moly? Nobody knows what moly is. And she says the word stops itself. There's nowhere to go with it. It stops itself. And I find that I'm always drawn to that in poems and that in translation, when a word stops itself, which, Heather, as you said, that first word in the Meteor is anero, and it's a verb, and it means everything blackens, everything goes dark, but it's just anero. And that emphasis on the end is really what made me want to translate the poem in the first place, and why I chose a single word to start my English version, because I wanted that stutter, I wanted that stop. And there's something about going into that stop, which makes you remember your body, makes you realize that you wouldn't say realize if it weren't for this part of your mouth, makes you remember that every aspect of language is in this physical thing of you. And there is something so fundamentally untranslatable and original about that. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, that I was really intrigued by that anero and the and also the remote past not being able to touch the present in your essay. But I wanted to ask about, because we're meeting with Poetry Daily, and we're thinking a little bit about writing poems, and how that writing our own poems as and how that might be on a continuum with the translation practice. So I wanted to just bring up first, Taije uses the phrase, the myth of the original, in speaking about the narrator's experience of childhood memory in the Meteor. And Matvei, in his writing prompt, discusses Jack Spicer's apocryphal translations of Lorca, and suggests we try our hand at creating a copy without an original, a translation of a poem from a language other than English, but a poem that doesn't exist. And Jonathan talks in his essay about his own turning away from translations of these Jueju poems and into creating originals to work and go deeper into this like sonic practice. And so I wonder whether any of you would like to talk about ways that translation has been generative to your own writing practice, and what types of music, forms, idioms, energies that you feel have entered your writing as a result of your translation work, or even just your experience as a person who's living in interlanguage or a multilingual person.
I want to hear someone else talk and speak to that, although I'm looking forward to it. If no one's going to jump into the rift, maybe I will go ahead and do so. So the music that is that's encoded in what we could, and it's not just because it sounds hip to call it the algorithms of the Tang Dynasty poetic constraints. We're talking about constraints that lock words both in their meaning and in their sound. both on the horizontal and vertical axes of the poem. So you have, say, a quatrain of 7 words, lines. Each word basically is counterposed to another word, both across and down the poem, both sonically and semantically, in relationship to parallel or antithetical parallelism. So it really is an extraordinarily complicated form, and it came through interlanguage into the Chinese language through the practice of mantra chanting. So when the monks of China, the kind of first converts to esoteric Buddhism, which was coming in from India, when practicing mantra, they had to learn Sanskrit or the Siddham script. And in doing so, they had to learn kind of language about language, a meta language, which is phonology. As they grasped with these abstract ideas of sound, they were able to apply it to Chinese. And for the first time, heard what we now call the 4 tones of Chinese. Prior to having the space, the conceptual framework to articulate what those sounds were, people only spoke Chinese, but now they could mold the sound. And so the sounds were molded in a way that reflected the classical Chinese cosmological schema that organized all information at that time in the imperial information system or knowledge system, yin and yang 5-element theory. And so these poems became a way to pass into the bureaucratic society. If you wanted a job in the empire, you had to be able to compose poems to these sound structures. Here's the interesting bit though. Everyone in China spoke a different language essentially, because of the accents and the dialects were so widely ranging that one couldn't write the constraints unless one could hear them beyond what one could make in one's mouth. So the rhymes were encoded in books called rhyme tables. And no matter what your accent was or what your dialect was, you can follow these patterns, these algorithms, and produce the sound of the Tao, of nature or of heaven. And then bring oneself, the substrate of the self, which is language, into accord with nature by balancing the yin and the yang, right? The male and the female energies of cosmology could be encoded in language. And then in doing so, one radiates that harmony in one's social relations. And that was the requirement for holding office. And this existed for 1500 years. And so what I was interested in is this kind of, and it is similar to maybe pure language, although this is a pure sound. And it's a sound that exists almost like a Kantian category of sound that extended way beyond China across all of Chinese 500 languages to Vietnamese, Korean, and Japanese, all writing these forms. And so the translation took me into this process of, well, maybe English could be, we could take English all the way in and convert it into Sino-English, into a medium that would perfectly replicate all of the rules that the other languages had to. And in so doing, we could tune ourselves actually to the classical patterns that are still being written more today in China than ever before because of the advent of the internet culture. And so it is a beautiful pre-pronunciation regime idea of language, not being something that is encoded in how one speaks, but how one rhymes. And the idea of rhymes is interresonance, the core concept of Chinese cosmology. So this is the goal of that project, is to get to tune, to rhyme English as a language to Chinese, so that they resonate. And the poems, each one of them extends this until hopefully one day it will be real.
That's really interesting. It's hard to fathom that there's a rhyme book, that everyone had to refer to the same rhyme book, even though they didn't speak the same, they didn't pronounce the same language. They had the same rhyme book. I can't quite fathom that, but it's wild. Pascally rhymes. I mean, Pascally was turn of the century when everyone rhymed. It was still all formal poetry. He allowed for free verse in some ways. He's a bit like our Walt Whitman, although obviously quite different. But I found myself, when I would translate his poems in end rhymes, in exact meter, and I often have versions of the poems that are in pretty solid iambic pentameter or tetrameter, and that do follow a rhyme scheme, they just sound silly because we do have a much more monosyllabic language than Italian, and Italian has it's incredibly fluid, and the words are long, and the emphasis isn't usually on the last syllable. So Dante and Pascali can get away with terza rima for days and not sound like a nursery rhyme, but we really can't. And I found myself in my revisions and with my editors at Princeton taking a lot of the rhyme out, and that has been and kind of fucking a bit also with the meter, sort of putting in stumbling blocks where there weren't stumbling blocks in the meter, in the drafts that had a more set meter. I think because he and I are both really heavy-handed, we want to say everything, and we're a bit maudlin. I like talking about Pascali as me and Pascali. We both write about our dead families a lot, and we're really into it, and that's pretty heavy, and can get a bit much pretty quickly. But in his verse, there's a real lightness of step. There's an incredible lightness and playfulness in Pascali. And I found myself trying to emulate that in some of that abstinence from rhyme, or cancellation of the rhyme, or lifting out of the metrical patterns. And I think that has translated also into some of my own work, that that the less is more, and also the rift being some of the most interesting moments in the music.
I had the same experience translating Shi, who rhymes in Chinese. He's a modern poet. I translated 110 poems of his and collected in a book called Winter Sun. And the first run through of maybe 20, 30 pages in the book, I followed his rhyme because I like this, this idea of trying to foreignize the English. The problem was it wasn't at all foreignized. It sounded like a nursery rhyme in English, or it sounded like something we already knew what it was, and it wasn't that. These were the rhymes of the Cultural Revolution, of kind of Maoist folk rhyme tradition in the 60s and 70s. And so there was no frame of reference to understand those rhymes or that meter. And yet it sounded, like you said, without the roadblocks, it just sounded all too English. Mm-hmm. And so I do completely understand that need, especially in working with modern work. For me, I've never been able to rhyme do this kind of matching exercise. Only with the classical, wherein the English has to be totally reinvented so that the ear doesn't know what it's hearing and takes it in from scratch. And only in that case can the entire mechanism, the entire prosodic structure of Chinese be brought in and revitalize English in a completely new way. If I'm not doing that, then it's incredibly hard. So you have to sneak it in with slant rhymes and assonance and alliteration to try to make it equally melodious, but not sound conventionally English in any rhyme or meter that pre-existed the poem.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. That I love how the conversation about sonic effects and the in these poems is such a multiplicity of ideas. It's so different than the binary discussion of like domestication versus foreignization, but instead sort of exploding those ideas in all these different ways, especially with those translations where you're talking about having to just hear it from scratch, not being able to put it in a frame of reference that you're familiar with at the moment. So I'm afraid I just noticed that it is 9. So I wanted to see if it's okay with you all, we could take a few minutes to take a couple of questions from, if people have a few, to put in the chat here, because we started a little bit late. So just if anyone, yeah. Okay, so we have one here. Vicky, would you like to just unmute perhaps and just ask your question verbally?
Sure. Hello, everyone. Yes, sorry for the long comment. I just wanted to say a few things. So I'm very impressed at the works of Matvei Yankelevich and Eugene Ostashevsky and how they've translated the burial poets and writers. I translated from Russian myself, and I could certainly appreciate the quality of those translations. And I was also looking for a book, maybe a book of joint translations of Daniel Harms. I do have the one, Invitation for Me to Think, by Alexander Vidensky. And I didn't see it, so I was hoping maybe it still exists.
Yes, there. I mean, I have a book of Daniel Harms that you can find pretty easily called "Today I Wrote Nothing," and that has a few things that Eugene and I did together, a few things that Simona Schneider and I did together, and Ilya Bernstein. So sometimes I've collaborated a lot on translations. So sometimes. In fact, currently I'm working on Mandelstam with the poet John High, and Eugene and I have worked on Vidensky, often in tandem, not collaborating on one poem, but like splitting things up. But even then, I mean, I think you'll see in the Vidensky very different styles of translation, but hopefully that's useful. And I just wanted to say, yeah, so, and then there are a few other, there's also the Oberiu anthology from Northwestern, but I believe it's out of print, but that has some collaborative translations of Harms and other Oberiu writers. But thank you for your interest in our translations and your flattering words.
Shane, would you like to jump in and ask your question? Sorry.
Yeah, I'll make myself known here. 1 second. Hello. So I'm an instructor at George Mason. And I guess I'm wondering, can one effectively teach translated poems without command of the source language? That being like poems in English, not so much focused on like, I guess like teaching them as like standalone pieces in English without so much emphasis on the like the art of translation.
I would just say that my hope is that people can read Vidensky without knowing Russian. I don't actually think that my job is like is for an elite audience of 18th or early 19th century scholars who kind of know the language and maybe are helped by me to know the language better or to read. You know, I can't subscribe to that kind of notion that that seems to make the translator just this intermediary for scholars or something like that. I do hope that I think that through the mutations that happen, of course, it's a different poem, but it is also not a different poem. It is just the thing that occurs through the translation process, and it's a kind of a cultural fact. This new poem is both a new poem and some kind of it related to that original in such a way that I think hopefully you can talk about the poem. You don't absolutely have to talk about it as, in fact, you should not necessarily talk about it as though it were not a translation, but there's no reason not to think about what is, what is going on in the poem in English should be possible to discuss in English without knowing the original language. I think that's what translation can do. And even if it's a bad translation, I think it can do that.
Maybe especially if it's a bad one. I would say, I mean, my whole book is kind of about this. I would say, what does it mean to have a command of the source language? Who has the command? is that who the poems are necessarily written for? So already I think that's like a very fraught issue. But second, I would say, like Matvei, I would expand that and say that I think that teaching translation, depending of course on what class it is, but if you're teaching a class about poetry, writing poetry or reading poetry, I think teaching things in translation are actually some of the best teaching I've ever done. Has been things in translation, looking at different choices different poets are making, maybe lining up different versions of them. Actually paying attention to the process is super useful. Not to mention the fact that you get a lot of interesting poetry that you wouldn't otherwise. I mean, the truth of the matter is that mostly things are not, not that often taught. And then what we're left with is a very much more homogeneous idea of what poetry can do. So I would hope that everybody teaches poetry, teaches something in translation. I mean, translation has been a huge part of the way poetry is developed as well. So.
Yeah, and Vicky says, don't you think that translating without the command of the original language and culture would be a mere transcription into a different language?
Huh, that's
I
an
don't know
interesting.
what that means, but
It's an
transcription, like you are just a machine or something.
Vicky, maybe you can clarify.
Yes, that's what I meant. Kind of I mean, these days you can do a lot of things with the internet. You can use the machine translation and translate from languages you don't know, kind of, sort of. But I think the quality of that translation will be iffy.
There's
I mean,
also
sometimes I would say, but sometimes it's good too. I mean, first of all, I would say we're always discouraged from translating because we're told we have to have this kind of mastery, or you will just be a mere transcriber or something like that. But the end result of that is that nothing gets translated, or translations don't get published. We get the homogeneity of American homogeneity. And I also don't think it's true, because often people who have not the greatest, like, super education are poets. Oftentimes poets are not the most super educated, and often translators are creative with what they do. I've translated a lot of things in Sweden. I've talked to people who don't know Swedish and who based on my translation start doing their own translations, and often they're better than mine. I mean, I hate to admit it. No, I don't hate to admit it. I love seeing that. I love seeing the permutations, and there can be multiple different versions. Hardly ever do I feel like it becomes transcription. I think that also the benefit of thinking about the rift is the fact that what that suggests is that there's something about the noisiness of language that goes into poetry and in translation. So I'm interested in that. I'm interested in noise. I'm not interested in eliminating that.
I was interested in gibberish, so it's good to be interested in noise.
Yeah, I am.
Sorry.
I would think that the more comfortable you feel with an original language, the more you run the risk of transcribing instead of translating, the more you fall into the trap of believing that you can convey and that you should convey information instead of this mysterious, stuttering, shifting movement of the mouth, which is, I think, poetry. And I'm also really interested in this question, Vicky. I also I translated this book of Pascali with someone who is Italian. I speak Italian, but I just studied it and learned it, and I'm not a native speaker. And I translated it with a native speaker, and she gave me the information, and I tried to make poems out of it. And the question of credit in that case fascinates me, and I wonder if others have can point me to more literature on this question of credit. I mean, I know that Seamus Heaney, for example, also translated Pascali, but didn't speak a word of Italian. And he asked an Italian woman to give him the meaning. He asked her to do a crib of it, or a literal translation. Maybe you could say a transcription. And then he made the poem, but I don't know her name because she is not credited with that translation. And that's actually not uncommon at all. And it's also interesting to me how it falls on gender lines often, with the poet being male and the informer being female. That's not across the board, but it does seem to be a thing. And I have not found essays about it, and I would like to, in terms of how we value communication and what forms of communication and why. And then going back to Shane's question, which I really liked, I don't think that we can effectively teach translated poems without command of the source language. And that's really why I love teaching translated poems, because we can't. We're mostly teaching failure. Like, we're teaching how failure works, how the original is over here, and we can fail to bring it over here in this way and in that way and in this way. And it's like teaching our students and ourselves all the most sophisticated and generous and nuanced ways we can say, I don't know, which seems to me that's sort of the benefit of education in some primary way. So yeah, I do teach, I of course teach translated work too. And the more I can say, this isn't the original, here's the original, and this isn't the original, here's the original, but these are all the different ways we can get to hear from it. And the more aware we are of that failure, of that shortcoming, the larger our understanding of the literature and our role in it becomes, I think. So I like your question.
I would maybe just add that I'm not sure that it's necessarily failure or shortcoming, but that each translation has a different purpose. If I were to compare Jonathan's translations with someone else's, I would see very quickly what kinds of different purposes translators have, and different not only cultural and sort of aesthetic biases, but political biases around what the translation is supposed to do and how it's supposed to be instrumentalized in teaching, or whether it's supposed to stand alone or be next to the text, or, there's just so many kinds of translation. And when we talk about like, well, should the translation do this or should it do that? It does all those things, or the translations do all those things. It's just that they don't all do them the same way. And so I hesitate when we think, I do want people to read this Vidensky poem and say, on one hand, I am reading Vidensky. I also want them to know that they're not reading Vidensky. The publisher wants them to think that they're reading Vidensky, the original, right? I want them to have a feeling like they're not reading me exactly, but I want them to know that they're reading my interpretation. But that's me. And I also, like someone like Heaney, Merwin, like the big poets that take on, like they get the contract because they're the big poet. It doesn't matter who Pascali is, right? No one has to hear about them if Heaney is translating, right? Because what the publisher is interested in is in Heaney's name. So it seems like that creates a very different kind of translation, right? Than yours, and X number of others. So I don't know. I think that it's important also to think about translations not being singular or one way of doing things, or the best or a good translation. It's like the term good translation makes no sense if you start thinking about the different modalities, reasons, purposes, it's really like you look at two very different texts, 5 different texts, and you say, well, this one's good. What does that mean? Like if this person's translating in 100 years ago and then 50 years ago, or at the same time, but from politically, aesthetically different, totally different spaces, it's really hard to determine the good or useful translation. It really depends on what your use is going to be, I think.
Yeah, I love this idea that translation can't really even fully displace another translation. They're always supplemental. They just continue to replicate or extend the possibilities, right? Every time. I wanted to say two quick things. One about Ezra Pound being the sort of voice of Ernest Fenollosa, himself a voice of those who helped him create his cribs. But Fenollosa's work, this is which Pound reimagines as Cathay. He was practicing a form of chanting, and he encodes the Chinese in the katakana and then into English from there. So he wants to capture the sonic structure, and his writing is about trying to bring over the stuff I was sort of talking about. And Pound excised all of this kind of sonic material from his translations and from the Chinese written character as a medium for poetry, and set in motion the silence for 100 years of classical Chinese poetry. One last thing just about transcription. I think of Teresa Ha-Kyung Cha's dictée, where she is transcribing English and is imagining it as a place where she disappears entirely and becomes the medium. But by doing so, her body is inscribed in every breath. And so as we try to transcribe, we still have Swedish in our mouth, right? Or Chinese in our mouth. The body will always encode the transcription, as do our grapheme writing systems. So Romanization, even itself, is transcribing something that preceded. English doesn't really belong in the Roman script to begin with. And every time we transliterate, we are essentially creating a new prosodic form for that language. So transcription itself is marvelous and full of indeterminacy and poetic becoming.
Thank you so much. I think that's actually a great place to end. And I earlier put the link to Johannes's book, Transgressive Circulation, in the chat. And I'm also putting the link to Jonathan's The Poetics of Emptiness, which expands a lot on what he just said about Fenollosa and dictée, in case you're interested in exploring that a little bit more. So I just thank you so much to our panelists for being here tonight. It was just really a joy to hear your poems and hear you talk about your work. I really appreciate you being here with us. And I just wanted to give one little announcement, if I can find it. But our next Poetry Daily, What Translation Sparks event is going to be in Martin or Sally, please correct me if I'm wrong on this, January 15th at 4 p.m. And it'll be the same Eventbrite link if you feel like joining us. And let's see. Yep, I have in fact deleted the rest of the information about that from my notes, but I'll just say thank you so much, everyone who attended, and to our panelists. I've just been looking forward to this all week, and it really exceeded my expectations. So thank you very much.